Hi, I'm Joyce Harper, Professor of Reproductive Science at the Institute for Women's Health at University College London. Welcome to Season 3 of my podcast, Why Didn't Anyone Tell Me This? This season, we'll be diving into topics that explore how to achieve good health and happiness. I'll be speaking with leading experts who will provide evidence-based advice and debunk some of the many myths around our health. Additionally, I'll be having conversations with individuals who bring unique perspectives through their lived experiences. In Season 3, we'll cover a diverse range of topics, including reproductive anatomy, inspiring female icons, chronic health conditions, factors that influence our well-being, and global women's health issues. I really hope you enjoy Season 3 of Why Didn't Anyone Tell Me This? Welcome to the first in the mini-series about understanding different chronic health conditions. And today we're kicking off with a discussion about dementia and Alzheimer's with Dr. Sarah McKay. Sarah is a neuroscientist and science communicator and runs the Neuroscience Academy, which provides online training in brain health and applied neuroscience for health. Sarah was born in New Zealand and obtained her MSc and PhD from Oxford University in the UK, and then moved to Sydney, Australia, where she conducted 5 years of postdoctoral research on spinal cord injury. Sarah shares brain science with a clear, science-first voice. No fluff, no headline, just solid research translated into useful, real-world insights. She has written 3 books: Baby Brain, The Woman's Brain Book, and Brain Health for Dummies. Her 2015 TEDx talk was about the virtues of an afternoon nap. She lives in Sydney's northern beaches, where she writes, teaches, swims in the ocean all year round, and turns complex neuroscience into practical tools and accessible stories. Welcome, Sarah.
Hello, Joyce.
So it's a great pleasure to talk to you today, Sarah. And you're my first guest on this podcast mini-series on understanding chronic health conditions. But before we get into dementia and Alzheimer's, let's talk about your journey and what led you to a career in neuroscience.
Oh, gosh, there wasn't much life before neuroscience because I started studying it in my first year of uni, well, at least in a first year uni Psych 101 class in 1993. They were talking about neurons and synapses, and I was like, this is the coolest thing I've ever heard about in my life. And so switched universities to study a degree in neuroscience. It was Otago University back in New Zealand, where I grew up, and that was in the 90s. And then I was very, very fortunate to win a Wellcome Trust, one of the Wellcome Trust 4-year funded scholarships to study neuroscience, Masters and PhD at Oxford, and met a lovely Irishman there. And I still think he's lovely all these years later. And then we moved to Sydney because he got a job here. And we thought we came to Sydney on a bit of a whim in 2002. And we're still here now because it's quite a nice place to live. And I suppose I've just stayed on that neuroscience path variously in doing postdocs, medical research. Then I switched into health and science communication, journalism, but I've always stayed with that neuroscience specialty. And then about 10 years ago, randomly for the ABC here in Australia, wrote an article on menopause and brain fog. And I actually interviewed Professor Sue Davis on the role of testosterone and brain health. Wrote up this little 500-word blog. It went absolutely gangbusters on Facebook, which was quite a surprise because I don't think menopause had been invented at that point in time, or at least the conversation around it hadn't really had any public kind of airing. And clearly people were interested in talking about it. And so then a kind of a book offer came on the back of that. And I decided I didn't want to write a book about menopause or pregnancy. I thought I'm going to take a womb to tomb, like lifespan, look at sort of the life and the times of the female brain, kind of, looking at each kind of age and life stage, not really knowing that much about women's health. And at that time, 10 years ago, there was still a ton of gaps in the research. And it's been a very exciting decade because women's health is just hasn't even blossomed, it's like exploded. I felt like it was quite niche 10 years ago, and now it's so mainstream. It's a very exciting time.
It is such an exciting time. And as you said, the last 10 years have been incredible. Ups and downs, which we're going to talk about. And you're right. I don't
Yes,
think
there's
10
lots
years
of
ago the
them.
menopause was invented.
I joke. We joke. Of course it was, just in case someone comes at us. But the Facebook post of that article I wrote is still there. The article's gone from the internet, but the Facebook post is there, and you can see all of the comments. And it is like you could be looking 100 years ago in time. How the conversation has changed and how much we've been educated and learned and how much the research has moved forward. Of course, there's still lots of gaps, but it's wild to think that was just 10 years. And like anything, when there are gaps, for a while we didn't know there was a gap, like women's health, like what that's some kind of really niche thing to do with breasts and vaginas, and that's about it. And now it's just kind of taken off. And I think in some instances the research has been slow to gather pace. In other instances, there's a wealth of research out there. It's just not in the public domain. And whenever there's gaps, both between the research and the public or the other way around, when there's a bit of a vacuum, information can fill that, and some of that information is great and some of it is not. And I guess I'm trying to sit in the middle there, communicating that out, spending lots of time talking to researchers and lots of time trying to spread the neuroscience news. And lots of the news is really good as well.
Yeah, it has been an exciting time for sure, filling in those gaps. Now we will come back to menopause, but let's park that for a moment. You do a huge amount of work communicating neuroscience, but today we're going to talk about dementia and Alzheimer's. I think everyone's affected by that somehow. Certainly, I have my mother, aunties, etc. So, can you start explaining what the difference is between dementia and Alzheimer's? What's the similarities and what's the differences?
Oh, that's a good point to start on. So dementia really is like an umbrella term we would use to describe a collection of symptoms or a constellation of symptoms, or maybe some people might even call it a syndrome, rather than a specific disease diagnosis. And so there's lots of diseases that can cause symptoms that are dementia-like. And a fair chunk of the dementia symptoms that we see in the population are caused by Alzheimer's disease, but there are a whole host of other types of diseases in which people would have dementia-like or dementia symptoms. So we might have frontotemporal dementia, which is what Bruce Willis has. We might have vascular dementia, which is due to changes in blood flow. People with other diseases like Huntington's disease or Parkinson's disease, or even, people with Down syndrome who grow up and grow older often develop dementia types symptoms. So it's really like dementia is the umbrella term, and propping that up are a number of different types of diseases, all which have their own kind of signs and symptoms and pathology and risk factors and causes, and to a greater or lesser degree, various treatments.
So let's talk about symptoms. So you said there's quite a range depending on the type of dementia. What sort of symptoms would people experience?
Yeah, there's a whole range of types of symptoms that we would see. I think the thing that people typically focus on, because I suppose that's become kind of what's popularized, or at least appears most apparent to other people, is like forgetfulness. And I suppose we all forget things at one time or another. And when you forget something, which is kind of what naturally our brains do all of the time anyway, that feels quite scary, because that feels like that's the main type of symptom of someone with dementia. It's the ability to kind of remember not just where they put the keys or did they order the kids' lunch, but it can start off very mild and then become much more kind of extreme to the point where people kind of won't know, won't remember who other people are in their lives. There's a bit of a saying, it's not that they're forgetting where they put the keys, but when they find the keys, they don't know what the keys are for. So we see this whole kind of range of cognitive symptoms, which includes forgetfulness. We see a range of behavioural symptoms, which might be things like decision making or planning or judgment, or the ability to carry out kind of day-to-day sort of tasks of, just being able to go to the shops and buy your groceries and come home and pack them away and cook yourself a meal. There's kind of like day-to-day behavioural activities. And then we might also see things like personality changes and changes in the ability to kind of regulate emotions or socially interact with other people. So there's a whole host of different sort of symptoms which can sit under that. And obviously they start off mild and kind of barely noticeable, and then over time they gradually build up. And once people sort of start worrying about them, and you could be worrying about your some aspect of how your brain is functioning for a whole host of different reasons, you can, take yourself off to see a GP or a doctor, and they might do some kind of pretty straightforward kind of rough screening test. And the GP surgery, we have tests like a mini mental state exam where there's various kinds of questions you might be asked. And if that is kind of flagging, oh, you're not scoring too well on that, then you might get referred off to a dementia clinic and maybe go through a formal diagnosis process. So it's a bit of a kind of a long staged process. Some people might start off with very mild cognitive impairment and might never progress any further. Other people might start off with mild cognitive impairment and then progress quite quickly down into a disease state. There's just this massive variation across kind of people and populations, and I suppose the different diseases that sit under that umbrella of dementia.
So if people are feeling that they're doing those sorts of things, as you said, I've just spent 10 minutes looking for my phone before we came on. I was really glad you were a bit late because I couldn't find my phone, and I found my phone.
Yeah.
But we shouldn't worry about those things. But if it's becoming where it's affecting our quality of life and picking up those early signs, should we go and see the doctor?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the thing is, we all forget things all of the time, and there's just different ages and stages of life when we attribute it to different things. So, you can't, if my teenage son can't find his phone, he'd probably blame, it would be my fault, or maybe the dog. But he's not blaming his baby brain or his pregnancy brain or his menopausal brain or worrying he has dementia or Alzheimer's disease. So there's going to be different ages and stages of life at which you would be more or less concerned. If you can't find your phone once when you're 18 years old, you're probably fine. But if you are continually losing your phone multiple times a day and you're kind of in your mid-60s, it's starting to interfere with your life, and there's other kinds of things going on as well, then you toddle off to the GP or your family doctor, and they'll kind of do that first assessment and then refer you on. Typically what we see, and I mean, I'm not a specialist or a geriatrician or a doctor, people, it was what we would start to say, once it's sort of starting to interfere with people's everyday life, their ability to kind of take care of themselves in their own home. And there's some really interesting, I've spoken to a geriatrician and Alzheimer's disease researcher, and she said it's really interesting because she does see some really gendered differences in when people might present to her as to when, kind of how far along that disease process they are. And particularly you might have like a very traditional couple whereby the wife's kind of done everything in the house and cooked all of the meals and always looked after the husband, and he's been retired for a number of years, and he might come and see her much further along his kind of progression than if it had been the other way around, because the house would have fallen apart and he wouldn't have eaten if she was unable to cook and clean and shop. So there's not necessarily always a set point in which a certain person is aware of it themselves. Sometimes it's when the other people around them also start to become impacted and they start to notice. And everyone's going to have very, very kind of a different, I suppose, tolerability, perhaps is one word, for where they are in that process, both themselves and then other people. Sometimes people who actually have dementia don't necessarily notice either, and it's the other people around them that are kind of guiding them through that process too.
Yeah, and that can be really scary. And you said when they go to the doctor, they would give them some tests. They do sort of quizzes and things like that, and then
Mm,
if
mm,
they
mm.
flag that, they'd refer them on. So, what can actually happen if you went to see a dementia specialist? Are there treatments? What can we do to help people in the situation?
Yeah, I mean, this is it's not like you would go to a dementia specialist and they would say, right, here's the pill, off you go, because we're not really at that point in time yet. As far as I'm aware of, and having spoken to, various people in this space, bearing in mind I don't do this work myself, um, essentially, and depending on who that person is and what kind of support they have, where in the world they live, what kind of support services that can be wrapped around that person, and how far along that disease process they are. If someone's just kind of showing mild cognitive impairment and they haven't quite reverted through fully into dementia yet, there's lots of kinds of support systems that can be put in place for that person, and the supports that they would give to someone above and beyond medications, which may or may not be appropriate, because it depends on like the cause of the dementia, um, are not necessarily that different than what we would do to kind of reduce our risk anyway. So it's making sure that that person is well nourished, making sure that person has reduced levels of stress, making sure that person is kind of has their mental health managed, making sure that person can sleep, making sure that person's on a good healthy diet, making sure that person stays reasonably cognitively engaged. And what you can do is you might not be able to revert back the disease, you do a U-turn and go back to having a completely healthy brain, but you might be able to flatline that decline down. And so there is some kind of studies, some kinds of interventions, particularly when they're this massively holistic, well, and typically very well resourced kind of intervention that's looking at all of those things I just said, might be able to flatline that decline. So you might not get a U-turn, but you might not descend into sort of full-blown dementia. That said, in some cases, that person might be reasonably far along, the kind of the path down into dementia by the time they get diagnosed, and you can kind of just, the best you can do is kind of look after that person. It's just going to be so different depending on who that person is. Someone with, that's diagnosed at a really young age because they have a very strong genetic risk, there's, early onset Alzheimer's disease in their family is going to be in a very different position than someone who, hits the age of 80 and starts to show mild cognitive impairment, and up until that point they've been living independently. There's two very different people there.
I want to pull up a bit more about the genetics and the lifestyle. Let's do the lifestyle first. So you
Yeah.
mentioned that those important lifestyle factors that can level off the decline.
Mm.
So what about
Mm.
preparing for that early with the role of decreasing your risk? How important is our lifestyle even when we're a teenager?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, starting from as young as possible. So the current kind of latest sort of research that's come out every few years, the Lancet, in partnership with all the Alzheimer's disease researchers in the world, do a kind of a big, massive sort of scan of the literature and put together this is what we know about risk factors. And by risk, and we can talk about modifiable risk factors, which are things that we can do something about, versus non-modifiable risk factors. So non-modifiable risk factors are things that are much more kind of, I suppose, biological in a sense, like your age. You can't get younger. I know some people think, if you take Botox and sit in an ice bath and smash back creatine, I don't know, whatever the latest trend is, you can reverse your age. We are getting older. Age is a non-modifiable risk factor. Your genes are a non-modifiable risk factor. You can't do much about that. Maybe in future we might be able to modify our genes, or probably not. But we're not really there yet. And then factors like biological sex. And biological sex is kind of a tricky one because it interacts with gender. So you've got your biology and your biography. In terms of modifiable risk factors, things that we can do something about, probably depends the age and life stage you're at, where you can kind of tweak and see shifts there. So we know, we see this globally, the degree of education you have, particularly what we'd call more like kind of formal primary, secondary, tertiary education. The more years of education that you have, the lower your risk much later in life. And that appears to not necessarily be about stopping the decline. It's almost as if it's a bit like you've built up so much kind of cognitive reserve with all of those years of education. You're starting off from a higher point. So even though you're still aging and you might like sort of start on that, cognitive decline down as you get older, you're starting from a higher point. So it's a little bit like the more you can kind of build those years of education and build that kind of, whether it's neural or whether it's cognitive kind of resilience all the way up before you start the decline. So we've got that as a risk factor. That's probably an early life one. Once we reach kind of middle age, we've got all of the things that we would do to protect our cardiovascular health. And so not a lot has really changed there. And we're really getting much better at both preventing and treating cardiovascular disease. So it's all of the kind of the oldies but goodies, like obesity, high blood pressure, your LDL cholesterol levels, all of those things that you would do to promote heart health, also promote vascular health. And I think sometimes we think about the heart, we forget about the blood vessels. And the reason blood vessels are important is because our brain is absolutely packed with, kilometers of like these really fine, blood vessels and capillaries, and we want them to be healthy so that we've got blood flow going to our neurons. So everything that we can do around that. And then there's some other factors in there at midlife. Air pollution is one that's modifiable, but probably not modifiable that easily from a personal perspective. If you live somewhere with lots of pollution in a city, perhaps, but you could do well to reduce kind of the pollution within your immediate home environment. Maybe hopefully not cooking over a fire, but there's plenty of parts of the world where that's how people cook, right? We're not all just kind of living in bougie, lovely homes and well-to-do neighbourhoods in lovely parts of the world. We've got social connection in there. And very intimately tied up with social connection is also this enormous risk factor, which is incredibly unsexy, and there's no one out there banging on about it on social media, and that is hearing loss. So midlife, untreated hearing loss at midlife is an incredibly important factor for, if it's untreated, increasing your risk for dementia. Because if you think about what happens if you can't hear anything, you just kind of withdraw socially from the world. Both you withdraw yourself, other people get frustrated with you. It's almost like you kind of turn in on yourself, and your brain is then not engaging with other people in the world and connecting and communicating in the way that you should. And then later on in life, we've also got vision loss, which is kind of, once you're you can kind of imagine if you're sort of in your 70s, 80s or 90s and you're starting to get vision loss as well, again, you're kind of shutting off a lot of your interactions with the world. And there's another couple of risk factors in there, I believe, like mental health and also traumatic brain injury. So there's all of these kinds of factors. I think there's 14 in there. I hope I've said all 14 of them. Oh, alcohol. That's the one. That's the one that no one wants in there. Luckily, it's only teeny. So all of these factors we know increase your risk. And if we could eliminate all of them entirely from the global population, chances are, the theory would be that we could eliminate about 45. That's just under half of cases of dementia globally. We're still going to have a lot of cases of dementia caused by various different diseases. But, if we could kind of somehow dial down on all of this, the thing that I think is really useful and important to realize is that when we look at incidence, so we've got prevalence of a disease and we've got incidence. Prevalence is like, I say, it's like how many people are swimming in the pool that have the disease, the prevalence pool. So we've got everyone, like, say, in the prevalence pool with Alzheimer's disease who's swimming around in that. And when you die, you go down the plug hole. That's mortality. So that's one way prevalence would decrease. How many people are, dying off? We're not getting anyone getting better, so no one's evaporating out of the pool, but we've got like inflows coming in, and inflow is like the incidence coming in. The inflow in many parts of the world is actually slowing down, particularly in healthy, wealthy countries in Europe, here in Australia, North America. Interestingly, not Japan, but we're seeing the incidence of cases of dementia slowing down, flowing into that pool. But because people are living longer, men and women, the pool is getting a bit bigger. So we can have increasing prevalence with decreasing incidence. And that's really interesting. A couple of the reasons why we believe there's maybe decreasing incidence, partly is just we're getting better at treating things like cardiovascular disease, and that's a massive risk factor. We're getting better at preventing cardiovascular disease, and once it's detected, we're getting better at treating high blood pressure. We've got bypass surgery, we've got lots of different medications that we can use to deal with all of these risk factors to kind of dial that risk down, and that's probably causing that trickle to slow slightly. Definitely in the healthy, wealthy countries, the education kind of component is not that much of an issue, because most kids in healthy, wealthy parts of the world are staying at least until the end of secondary school, and many going on to tertiary education. It's in those low and middle income countries, particularly the low income countries, where kids might, not even finish primary education, and that's massively increasing that risk. So we're seeing different kinds of trends in different parts of the world based on how those risk factors add up in those parts of the world, which I think is fascinating.
Yeah, I want to just reiterate what you said about 45%. I mean, that's so incredible that 45% of dementia is preventable if we look after our lifestyle. And in the UK, if people want to read some more, wherever they are, the UK Alzheimer Society, just to reiterate what you said, they talk about the many risk factors, but exercising, drinking, reducing your risk, exercising, drinking less alcohol, don't smoke, stay mentally and socially active, manage our long-term health conditions. As you said, protect our hearing
100%.
and eyesight, protect our head. I've got boys who play football every time they head of the ball. And as you said again, be aware of your environment.
Yeah, 100%. And it's not just it's this kind of holistic kind of and it sounds really boring as well. It's not very exciting to have to do all of these are like all of the things that we kind of know. It's like, I think everyone's like, is there not some magic solution yet? It's like, you've just got to do all of the things. And I guess different people, depending on who you are and where you live in the world, will have more or less access to the ability to be able to do these things. And I mean, lifestyle change and lifestyle modification is a very, very hard task. It's a hard ask for some people. Like lots of, alcohol is addictive. I bloody love a glass of wine. It's really hard to not want that every single night, one or two maybe. Despite knowing it might not necessarily be the best thing for me, it is really, really hard for some people to convince, to get out and exercise and to, give up smoking. I mean, smoking is also addictive. It's easy to say and to understand the theory, but that doesn't necessarily always mean for everyone that these changes are very easy and straightforward, and particularly despite the fact that people are really scared about dementia and Alzheimer's disease. It feels like the payoff's quite far down the track. If you're in your 20s, you're not really caring about what your brain's going to be like when you're 80. We would like to think we might be, but I don't necessarily think that's always the case. So it takes quite a while for, and a lot of, the public health campaigns over years and years and years have been trying to work away at this, slowly kind of chipping away and chipping away and chipping away. But risk reduction isn't necessarily always easy. It would be great if it was.
You're right, though. It's not very sexy saying look after your lifestyle, but you're the first podcast in this series about chronic health conditions, and I am pretty 100% sure that everyone is going to say that preventing every chronic health condition we're looking at, lifestyle is the most important. So I
100%. It's all of the things: obesity, diabetes. I don't know what else you're going to be talking about. Osteoporosis, like you name it. Everything's going to be in this, and whether we're approaching it from a hormone perspective or an inflammation perspective or a obesity perspective or a diet perspective or an exercise perspective or social connection, whatever. And when it comes to our brain is trying to make sense of all of these signals, and that's why all of those signals add up shift your risk one way or another. But I think it's also really important when I'm thinking about risk. I always imagine those old-fashioned scales, and you can put what increases your risk as a weight on one side, and what kind of decreases your risk as a weight on the other. And all that's doing is kind of tipping the odds, hopefully in your favor or not, because obviously underlying that, we have things like our genetic risk profile and various other factors you might not be able to do anything about. And sometimes you can do all of the things right and still end up, it's like people can have never smoked a cigarette in their life and be diagnosed with lung cancer.
Yeah.
All we can do is try our best. And I find sometimes well-being messages can be a bit pious and a little joyless, and we're not having a lot of fun along the way. So I think to try and keep a little bit in perspective as well. I don't think that the primary goal of midlife should be to not die, because you don't want to spend your whole time worrying about, we're going to die, right? Worrying about this. I think sometimes there's a bit of perspective lost in the world of well-being. It doesn't seem very fun sometimes.
I've embraced well-being, and I'm I'm doing a lot about the positivity and the joy of exercise, the joy of cooking lovely food and being in nature. So
yes,
yeah, it's I think it's an important narrative. I think we can turn that round.
Yeah, we want lifespan and we want health span, but we want some joy span too.
And
I think
you've mentioned alcohol a few times. I'm afraid that
only because
I've got a terrible Christmas present. Those that listen to my podcast have got a terrible Christmas present for me, because just before Christmas, I'm doing a podcast about alcohol.
Oh,
it's not going to be good.
And I mean, to be fair, we probably shouldn't be drinking it, but also having a drink with your friends is also a great time. I'm definitely not a teetotaler. So yeah, but in terms of the overall risk profile, the latest data has kind of got alcohol is about kind of 1 or 2% or something of that, 45. I think compared to something like hearing loss, which is 7%, it does pale in comparison to that. So really it's about kind of, keeping a lot of these things in perspective. I'm only saying that because I like a glass of wine and, I want a bit of joy span.
I like a glass of wine.
So I'm not drinking a bottle of vodka a night. I'm just having maybe a glass of wine. So yeah, don't do what I say. Don't do what I do. What's that saying?
What about training our brain? So people talk about doing puzzles, learning new skills, learning the piano, a language. Will that help dementia?
Yeah. A number of years ago, brain training was the big thing. Remember, Lumosity used to be advertising on TV, and I think that they actually got fined and got told it's very naughty for you to say that if you do the brain training, you're not going to get Alzheimer's. We know that keeping cognitively engaged throughout the course of your life is incredibly important. That's where that education aspect comes in. You've got further to fall once you do start, because you are going to age, so you're going to build that kind of resilience in. And certainly the more cognitively engaged you stay throughout life is better for you. How you go about that is really up to you. And I often say to people, if you've got like an office job and you're working on a computer all day and the work that you do is reasonably cognitively engaging, you don't need to be going home and doing Sudoku or Wordle or the crosswords or whatever. You're probably doing enough. You probably should be doing something that's getting you up and out and about and moving your body. So less screen time for you and more green time instead. But if your job is reasonably physically active, or you need, it's like kind of what can you add in that you're not already doing typically in the day. And I think that you've got to enjoy it. It's got to be challenging. It's got to be, and the more ways that you can kind of engage as many different types of modalities as possible, So, you could do crosswords, but you could also perhaps learn, go to dance classes, which is kind of ticking off the cognitive challenge, the movement, and the social. So, we can also be quite creative at thinking about the ways in which we can cognitively and intellectually stimulate and challenge our brains. There is also some evidence that the more you delay retirement, the better, particularly if you've got a reasonably intellectually challenging job. And some research has come out looking at the different types of professions that people are working in, and which professions give you kind of more or less protection against mild cognitive decline or dementia later in life. And interestingly, the two top professions are not necessarily what people might think, but they are ambulance drivers and taxi drivers, the old-fashioned type of taxi driver, like the black cabbie, not, the Uber with his iPhone. Because what our brains sort of evolved to do, if we think about it, is actually navigate through the world and be constantly making decisions. And you've got constant streams of visual information coming in. You're constantly kind of planning and thinking ahead and making kind of decisions. That kind of the intellectual stimulation that comes from navigation is an incredibly powerful type of, I suppose, cognitive stimulant for you. And we don't often think about that. So, perhaps don't take up taxi driving, but maybe you could take up orienteering, or I don't know. I'm sure there's some new kind of cool urban exploration game out there that people could do.
I'm glad I don't have to take up crosswords because I'm terrible, but I don't want to retire. So I'm okay. I'm okay. Now,
yeah, you're all right. Oh, you're right. And if you retire, do something. Don't just stop. I think that there'll be people out there say you're not retiring, you're just going on to the next kind of phase of, engagement.
Yeah, perfect. Now, we're going to go on to women's brains and men's brains. So the data about women and men getting dementia and Alzheimer's is quite different. So can you tell us what's happening there and the data about the numbers about what's different?
Yeah, so this is when it's really interesting, because if we look and because there's dementia and then there's the different types of dementia, and there's different, the biological sex differences that we see for Alzheimer's disease might be slightly different for, say, vascular dementia, because vascular dementia is often kind of comes about secondarily to cardiovascular risk. And typically, although that's starting to change now, men had worse cardiovascular health because historically they were more likely to smoke and drink and have very, very stressful jobs. So they were more likely to develop cardiovascular problems. So they were more likely to get vascular dementia compared to women. Women still get that, but the risk kind of tipped more towards men. And Alzheimer's disease, there tended to be more women than men. But again, it depends on whether you're looking at prevalence. And I think this is what's interesting, how many people are sort of swimming in the pool in any one country. And you've just got to kind of look at different countries in the world as well. You're looking at a country in the world, how many people are swimming around in the prevalence pool who are diagnosed with this within even a certain age group. And so if you look at kind of people above the age of 90, how many people are swimming in the prevalence pool, there's going to be way more women than men, because women tend to live longer. So the men have been sucked out the plug hole younger. But what were the rates coming in, and at what ages were people coming in? So there's a difference between prevalence, how many people are alive with the disease, and how many people are flowing in. And we're seeing this kind of, the incidence, I think, is waxing and waning over time in different parts of the world. When you kind of, some parts of the world, sort of during your 60s, 70s and 80s, we're seeing the incidence of males and females coming in at a similar rate. And then once you kind of hit 85, then females are definitely flowing in more. But again, all of those ratios vary depending on where you are in the world, because there's different kind of risk factor profiles coming through. So if you're looking at low income countries, you're seeing girls receiving far less education than boys, and perhaps less enriched occupations, and perhaps more stress. Maybe they've been raising babies, have had less access to healthcare. And so those women are far more vulnerable. And so they're going to be flowing in at a much higher rate compared to the men into the Alzheimer's disease prevalence pool late in life, whereas in, say, healthy, wealthy countries like Australia, the incidence is going to be a little closer in. So it's a much more complicated than simply biological sex as the determining factor and whether what your risk will be. So stats, they're kind of interesting. If we're looking at the prevalence pool of women over the age, people over the age of 80, there's more women swimming around, as I said. What are the contributing factors to that? And so that's really the question. And as I said, it's going to be multifactorial. It is partly biology and it is partly biography. What's the biology underpinning that? Then there's all of these different kinds of factors at play. So part of that is due to, I suppose, your lifetime of hormonal exposure. And there's some really interesting research that's being done. I was just sitting in on a webinar about this yesterday, because we've got all this great research coming out of the UK Biobank and all of these kind of big data, kind of collaborative sharing consortiums globally, but there's not really any good, clear, standardized measures yet of kind of the reproductive contribution or the hormonal contribution to things like, say, mental health across the lifespan and dementia risk. And so they're trying to find ways to sort of standardize these measures so we can look across populations. Because you could have, say, a girl who gets her period at 15 and then goes into menopause at 45, and she never has any babies and never went on the pill. So then you've got someone, how many years is that? 30 years of kind of monthly cycles. That's your kind of hormone exposure. You could have someone who gets their period at 10, goes into menopause at 55, has 5 pregnancies, a couple of those were IVF pregnancies. She's used the oral contraceptive pill. She's gone on menopause hormone therapy. You've got a completely different hormonal exposure there as well. So even when we start breaking down the data around, your reproductive history, your hormone exposure across the lifespan, there's just incredible amounts of variation and variability in there. So we're not quite at the point yet when we can kind of unpack exactly what are the biological contributors to that within a group of women. And we've got, looking at a woman compared to all men, it's pretty fascinating. But luckily, there's some really good, sharp minds working away on these problems.
Right. Let's really delve into this now, because out there in the last 10 years, we've definitely had a narrative that menopause causes Alzheimer's, and that the cure for this is taking hormone therapy. And all of it's due to estrogen, because we've lost our estrogen, our brain just disintegrates, and then we get Alzheimer's. So that's the narrative I've heard people say. And I've definitely heard women tell me that they are taking hormone therapy solely with no symptoms, but solely to prevent getting Alzheimer's. So what is your view on that?
I would not take that view. And as a scientist, I feel like I'm banging on about this all the time, and it's so boring. The data is mixed. So if menopause caused dementia, and these are not my words, these are words of Pauline Mackey, who is a women's health psychiatrist and neuroscience researcher who's just done a ton of this work. She said if menopause caused dementia, then all women would end up with dementia and we wouldn't get men who get dementia. So menopause can't be the cause. Like anything, it perhaps is potentially a contributing factor. But again, it's not just the fact that you have gone through menopause. One contributing potentially protective factor may be the amount of estrogen you have been exposed to across the course of your lifespan. So as I've said, between menarche and menopause, there's a massive variation in the amount of estrogen that you're exposed to. And that's just one potential factor which might be contributing to your risk later in life. And we think that potentially exposure to sex hormones might kind of tweak your risk one way or another. And some of that evidence comes particularly from women who have what we might call premature ovarian insufficiency, and that they kind of have gone through menopause by the time they're at the age of 40, and they are at an increased risk. but it's only an increased risk. It's not like it's a straight line. They're going to be the ones that get dementia and no one else will. And there is some evidence that if those women have their hormones replaced, that can lower their risk. But again, it's always just, it's tipping things in your favor or not. There is some evidence that some of the changes that we do start seeing in women's, and in brains midlife, and women's brains perhaps do start to accelerate in that peri and post-menopause time. But again, that's just one of the kind of many factors in there. The studies that have been done looking to see because the easiest answer would be if it was menopause, we could just put the hormones back in and we prevent dementia. We're not seeing that data very clearly. And even today on Instagram, I saw a claim about that from someone who I would have thought would have known better, made a very clear and explicit plain claim saying, we have the clinical evidence that HRT will prevent Alzheimer's disease. And I went and I said to this person, both in the comments and then in the back end, because I know her, I said, that's not the case. You know that the data is mixed. And she says, oh, yes, I know the data is mixed. It depends on your genetic profile. It depends on the timing of your menopause. It depends on when you start taking hormone therapy. It depends on whether you're taking it orally or whether you're taking it through your skin or whether you're taking it in combination with a different type of progesterone or progestogen. She said, of course, it varies. The data is mixed. And I'm like, well, if you agree the data is mixed, then we simply cannot make that first statement that you made. And this is the problem. We've got people making statements that some data might support, but the overall kind of consensus, because we've got to look at what all of the data shows in combination, is not showing HRT will prevent dementia. What the data is it's mixed. Some studies are finding in some women it reduces risk, depending on when you start, what kind of formulation you take, your age, your genetic profile. Others are finding, did I just say it increases risk or decreases risk? I don't remember. Others are showing the exact opposite. It depends, again, on, the formulation, your risk, your genetic risk, etc. Other studies are finding it's like completely neutral. And when we kind of look at the consensus data, there's this really cool AI tool called Consensus. You can go to it through ChatGPT or just look it up online. You can literally put into that, does HRT prevent Alzheimer's disease? And it literally shows you, some studies say yes, some studies say no, some are mixed, some are uncertain. And that's just simply where we're at the moment. And that is okay. What that means is we can be using menopause hormone therapy or HRT, or whatever you're calling it, wherever in the world you are, to deal with the symptoms that you may be experiencing, particularly vasomotor symptoms, maybe depression, maybe it's going to help you sleep. Is it going to help you brain fog? It's a bit more unclear there. But if you're using it to treat your vasomotor symptoms, it's not going to guarantee you're not going to get Alzheimer's disease. It's not going to guarantee you're going to get Alzheimer's disease. At the moment, we're not entirely sure. We need more data. So anyone claiming otherwise is, I hate to use the word cherry picking, but literally they're only looking at the data that suits them. Someone could just as easily say it's going to cause dementia. And there will be people out there that will be saying, if you take HRT, it will cause dementia, because there are also studies that are showing that. So we've just got to kind of sit with the unknowingness right now, and use it for currently what I suppose the menopause guidelines and indications say. Take it to treat your symptoms. It'll probably reduce your risk it'll probably make your bones a bit stronger or reduce your risk of osteoporosis. At least that's what they say here in Australia. Maybe if you're hormonally sensitive, it might help with the depression, but it probably depends on your prior history of depression. But apart from that, we can't cast forward. And I'm okay with that, but lots of people aren't, because that's the tool that we've got at hand, right? And if that's the only tool you've got, it's almost like, if you've only got a hammer, everything's a nail. And that's kind of not a very fair message, a very fair, as in kind, message to be putting out into the world, because that would be that would be great. It would be if it was an easy solution. It'd be great if it was HRT, right?
Yeah, it would
save everyone.
Yeah,
it would be great. Interestingly, no one ever talks about this. there is stronger signals. If you look at the UK Biobank data only, there are stronger signals emerging for the role of oral contraceptives in being protective than there is for HRT. And there's no one out there saying, oh, everyone should be on the pill to prevent HRT, but actually the data for that's slightly stronger. But that's not a message that, in fact, it's like never take the pill and only take HRT. It's like gone. It's all very extreme. And that, do you know why is that? Because where's everyone getting their information from? Everyone's getting their information from social media. What messages drive social media? The ones that are like exciting and sold by charismatic, shiny people. You're not boring people who are going, oh, the data's mixed, and you should just do some exercise. So yeah, social media isn't just ruining the youth; it is ruining all of us.
It really is. And for World Menopause Day, I'm going to be talking more, very controversially, to Amanda Thebe about all of these issues around menopause. But you are so right. The last 10 years, what has really driven me crazy is this misinformation. And I'm an evidence-based scientist. I've sat down and read all the clinical trials. I spent a couple of days last year and I read them all. And there were some studies that showed that women who were taking hormone therapy had higher risk of had higher prevalence of
higher
Alzheimer's.
risk. Yeah, there's higher risk, there's lower risk, and there's no risk. And so it might be that hormone therapy actually is not the thing that's going to matter more than the other thing. It might be maybe, in 10 years' time, the Lancet will come out with their like 45, 50% modifiable risk factors. And maybe if you're taking hormone therapy at the right age, for the right reasons and the right formulation, maybe it might like be 0.5% tweak in there. But I don't think it's suddenly going to come in. Like I say, we've got these scales, we've got the risks on one side and we've got the benefits on the other. At the moment with HRT, one, we don't know how big that weight is, and two, we don't know which side of the scales to put it on. Because some studies are saying put it on this side, some studies are saying put it on that side, so we're just kind of in the middle going, well, okay. Just tell that why that message can't make its way out there is beyond me. Why people will only look at the story that suits their narrative and what they are selling. It's unnecessary. We don't need to be making stuff up when we can tell the truth.
Here. And my mother had Alzheimer's. Some of my aunties did. If I thought hormone therapy was going to help me, I would be on it, and I am not on it. So,
and I'm on it. And I was one of these people that took the pill for decades. Loved the pill. It was great. So I'm not here saying, oh, the pill's good for everyone all of the time. It just suited me. I'm also allergic to penicillin. I'm not out there saying no one should ever take antibiotics because they'll give you a full body rash and you'll regret it for weeks. That antibiotic doesn't suit me. We're all so incredibly individual, and what works for some people some of the time doesn't work for everyone all of the time, and that's okay. I think we just have to try, and I understand why people don't like to necessarily trust not the consensus, but it's not as exciting to go away and look at like the Menopause Society guidelines or look at the consensus meta-analysis when you have got a shiny message on Instagram contradicting that. It is far more engaging to trust an individual person's telling you something that feels captivating and real and intuitive. I understand that, but those messages don't typically deal with the nuance. I don't even like that word, nuance, and also don't take into account the massive kind of individual variations that we have in people. And then I suppose that's kind of what you hope a good relationship with, a good, whether it's your family doctor or your GP or women's health specialist or whatever, you can have that conversation and talk about all of those ins and outs and details and risks and benefits and come up with something that works for you rather than assuming everyone's all going to be the same. Everyone should be on HRT, I don't think is the right message.
And what I say to everybody, and this will be a message in all these podcasts about chronic health conditions, is go to the societies. You said the societies are
Yeah.
giving people evidence-based medicine. So look at the British menopause, look at
Mm.
the international menopause, but also for this, for Alzheimer's and dementia, go to the Alzheimer's and dementia websites, the society websites in your
Mm.
country, and see what they say. I've
Yeah.
never seen any of them say take hormone therapy. So
No, no. And the Lancet did consider, it wasn't that they ignored hormones, they ignored menopause hormone therapy, they ignored menopause when they did their latest review. They included that, they looked at that, and then they decided right now the evidence isn't strong enough for us to include it or exclude it as a risk factor or a protective factor. That's because they couldn't make a decision one way or another, so it's not in there at all. And that's just kind of how it is. Maybe it's the same as any other medication, it's the same as we're not telling people to take aspirin all of the time either anymore. We used to, because there's risks and there's benefits depending on who you are and your age and your disease profile and etc., your overall health when you're starting it, why you're starting it. Yeah, I mean, I don't find it a complicated story to tell. But sometimes I feel like I'm fighting. And I don't want to keep on fighting on social media as well. And you may have seen this. As I said, I questioned someone on social media today only because I know this person personally. And I thought, not that she knew better, but I know she knows the data. So I wasn't sure why she made such a strong statement saying that HRT would prevent Alzheimer's disease. And now I'm concerned that because that will be perceived as me not supporting another woman.
yeah.
I'm arguing with someone. It just gets perceived by everyone else as this fight. Why can't you just all get on? Why can't you support each other? Why do you have to take someone else down? And it's not personal about this person. It's a critique of a statement, and social media hasn't left us any space anymore. And even if no one necessarily comments with those, why aren't you supporting her, in the comments, there's people watching that are gathering information on who they think is on what side or another. And it's just, I mean, maybe you're going to talk about this tomorrow in your podcast with Amanda. It's just become very kind of heated. And if we had have just stuck to the data, it would have been okay. But we didn't.
Yeah, you and we talk about evidence-based science and evidence-based medicine, and we are frustrated. But we're not trying to bring other women down. We're just trying to debunk the myths that are being perpetuated by the shiny people.
Yeah, and I find it really frustrating, and especially if you can go to a conference and you can see like a really good debate. There was a menopause. Was it the World Menopause Society? I can't remember which menopause conference it was in Melbourne earlier this year or last year. I've kind of lost track of time. And there was this really great debate between Pauline Mackey and Jayashri Kulkarni, and they're both women's health psychiatrists. And Pauline was saying if someone gets depression in menopause or perimenopause, maybe the first line treatment should be what worked for them last time they had depression. And typically it's women with a prior history of depression who are going to show up with depression. Dr. Kulkarni was saying, actually what we're seeing is this is a brand new kind of depression that women are turning up with in the perimenopause, and we should be treating it as a hormonal depression. Now, there's evidence to support both of their stories there, and they had this really great debate where they kind of talked through the data, and it was a proper moderated debate. It was fascinating. It wasn't one woman tearing another woman down. Like, just take the personalities and the silly, it's not high school, out of it, and just look at, like, that's how science is done. We kind of look at the data and build it up and pull it apart and look at it from different angles and discuss and debate, and that's kind of how we progress. And when we don't know, we say we don't know. But that kind of ability to have those reasonable conversations has been lost, because as soon as you might disagree with someone, even if you're playing the ball, not the player, and I try to be super strict with playing the ball, not the player, it's seen as some kind of like you're having a personal little row or tiff with someone. And it's so disappointing that that's the point where we're at, because I have now almost got to the point where I don't bother anymore saying anything. If I see something, even if I know it's fundamentally wrong and I disagree, I'm like, there's just no point, because it just gets turned into a personal little row that everyone's watching with their popcorn. It's just not worth it. And it's very sad that it's got to that sort of point, but whatever. I just do what I do and don't let the others do their thing.
I have the same. If I make a comment and say I don't agree with this statement, the evidence, I don't think the evidence is there, I get trolled for weeks and weeks by the public, who say that I don't know what I'm talking about, even though I'm a professor of 40 years in academia. But
yeah, it's I mean, and that's how science has always been done, right? Sometimes academia is a blood sport. I couldn't cut it. It was so brutal. But it's good because that's what the data is about. Like, that's how we keep the rigor in there, and we should be able to discuss the data rigorously. And I think another sort of issue is that, particularly because of the gaps within women's health, we've got activism and lobbying in there to make a case for more funding or more attention, etc. And activism sometimes doesn't necessarily always go alongside evidence. And it sounds like the evidence base has stayed in old school and the dinosaurs or the boomers or whatever, and then these words get kind of thrown around instead of the caution and the thought and the wisdom being respected. It's dismissed for what's new and flashy, and that's kind of what the world of wellbeing's been doing for a really long time, kind of offering the silver bullet magic solutions, snake oils or whatever. It's started to creep now into conversations around science, now that science is being discussed on social media. And so I have more or less, not resilience for it, but desire. Sometimes I'll go in and I'll engage, and then you get burned, or you get reported to Instagram, threatened with being shut down, just because you've said the biopsychosocial model might be a cool approach, which is literally what has happened to me in the past. And then you just kind of go, it's not, I don't know whether it's worth it. I'll just go back to just focusing on my messaging, commenting on my posts only, and writing my books and doing my podcasts, and hopefully it'll filter out.
And just to say that if new evidence comes in, if new studies come in, you and I would take them on board for sure. But
100%. Yeah. Like I said, if menopause hormone therapy prevented dementia, I would be shouting it from the rooftops.
Yeah.
100%. Instead, I'm here talking about untreated hearing loss and hearing aids and stigma about getting hearing loss treated. It's that's so unsexy and uncool, and does not froth the social media algorithms. It's not sexy at all. It is so unsexy. If I had something better to say about hormones, I would be saying it. Instead, I'm really, really, really interested in what's happening with how the data is rolling out and how it's being studied. And time will tell. I would certainly be the first person out there saying it. And also, I'm like taking hormone therapy because I came off the pill and I immediately started having vasomotor symptoms, which disrupted my sleep. And I've always been like, I can smash out 8.5 hours and get a score of 90 on my Fitbit every night. And as soon as I went from the pill at age 49 to cold turkeying, I was like, this is very pleasant. I'm like, oh my goodness, this is what these hot flashes are that they're talking about. And it just started disrupting my sleep. So within 10 days, I was back at the GP going, I don't like this. She said, I put a with this for 7 years. And I said, I've done 7 days. I said, my sleep is far too precious to muck about with. So then I went on hormone therapy, which doesn't touch the sides in the same way as the pill did, because the synthetic hormones in the pill are so high, and which suited me personally very well. It was also a great contraceptive. And I'm on hormone therapy, and it doesn't touch the sides in the same way, but I'm sleeping well. And for me, that's more important than anything. And, who knows what's going to happen down the track.
And you mentioned hot flushes. So there was a study recently that said women who have hot flushes are at higher risk of dementia. So what's your your view about that?
Yeah, so there's and this is some work like Pauline Mackey and Rebecca Thurston have done, which is this really kind of interesting correlation. This is kind of where cardiovascular risk almost kind of sits in the middle. But again, the story isn't necessarily that neat and tidy once you put the hormone therapy back in. So whether women who have hot flashes probably have a higher risk of cardiovascular disease anyway, like maybe the two kind of go hand in hand. And certainly if I look at my family history, like my dad had bypass surgery at 59 and he was like a vegetarian, he took a reasonable care of his health and had always treated his high cholesterol. So I've kind of got probably a biological propensity for that. I also get migraines and, in the past I had high blood pressure when I was pregnant. So I've probably got some kind of biological risk propensity there, which is why I'm like always flogging myself at the gym, like doing all of the things to have my cardiovascular fitness as good as possible. So this is the thing. So we've got hot flashes, maybe just kind of hand in hand with cardiovascular risk. So maybe they're a sign that you should manage your cardiovascular health. Or maybe it is the kind of the more hot flashes that you have that in some way increases your cardiovascular risk. So instead of being hand in hand, like one kind of causes the other. And maybe that is something to do with, for every hot flash you have, your body is desperately trying to cool you down because it is perceived that your body temperature has suddenly gone really, really high. And it's just for some reason in your hypothalamus, I don't know why estrogen sets the thermostat in your hypothalamus that it does. Once estrogen's gone, the thermostat narrows. And so your body only needs to do a small increase in temperature to kind of your brain to go, oh my God, it's hot in here. Panic, 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 panic stations. Cool her down, cool her down. And that is a big sort of sympathetic response. And that kind of mass sympathetic response might be, in a way, stressing your cardiovascular system, and so kind of in turn increasing your cardiovascular risk. So we don't quite know the necessarily biological mechanism there. And then we also know that the worse your cardiovascular health, you increase your risk for dementia, because one, you've got you might have higher blood pressure, you might cause damage to the little blood vessels in your brain that you want to keep healthy. And so that can kind of cause what we might, that might sort of start causing almost like kind of micro damage in the white matter of your brain, which could be like a precursor to go on to develop pathology and then dementia. So it's quite a complex scenario in here. And this is also why there are a lot of conversations around, if we are using hormone therapy to treat hot flashes or vasomotor symptoms, does that lower your risk of cardiovascular disease? And again, some studies appear to say, it decreases your risk a little bit. And other studies seem to be saying, we're not so sure whether it's increasing your risk. And again, it depends on, your age, your life stage, your overall health, your genetic profile, the formulation of hormone therapy you're taking. Is it estrogen only? Have you got a synthetic progestogen? Is you taking it orally? Are you taking it through your skin, et cetera, et cetera? It's a really complicated story. I think the best sort of story we can tell is the better your cardiovascular health, the better your brain health. How you get there and how hormone therapy fits into the picture is kind of confusing at the moment. It's not clear yet. But there's people working on it.
Good. Now, are there any new treatments or research directions that you're excited about for dementia and Alzheimer's?
Oh, I think that a lot of the work that's being done now, these kind of big consortium studies where, the Wellcome Trust has just put a lot of money into kind of this, what have they called it, care. Um, I don't know whether it's something like, I'm not sure what CARE stands for, but it's about looking at Alzheimer's disease risk and endocrinology. So looking to see in multiple centres around the world, what can we understand about the progression of women going through all of these reproductive kind of milestones in their lives, and what are the risks or benefits for brain health and Alzheimer's disease risk later in life. So the Wellcome Trust has put a lot of money into this big kind of consortium, which is lots of different kind of labs and research groups in the US and in different parts of the world. So I think that the kind of the excitement for me is, the kind of the research consortiums and the data sharing that's going to come out of that, and the really cool statistical analyses that will be able to be done once we've got big data sets. And also the work that's being done, as I said, I sat in on a webinar a day or two ago with Winnie Orchard, who works with Emily Jacobs and her research group in California, which looks at women's health across the lifespan, and how they're trying to come up with these sort of standardized ways of assessing what happens to girls and women across the course of our lives, and how can we kind of standardize the data collection. This is very boring for lots of people, but I think is cool. Standardize the data collection through really good, careful surveys, so that we can look at different studies from different research groups in different parts of the world and different populations. The example they gave was when the menopause straw staging was developed, and those kind of 10 stages of menopause based on signs and symptoms you may have about length of your menstrual cycle or whatever, and yet they're now able to sort of stage where you are in that kind of menopause kind of continuum. And that's standardized that data collection, which means then we can look across populations and look across different study groups and pull all of that research together, and that really moves things forward. So unless we've got good, clear, careful, thoughtful data collection that has been gathered, not just someone putting a survey on Instagram and asking people to talk about their symptoms and were you given the wrong treatment for depression. I always do these surveys so I can see what they were like. I went and did one the other day, and it was like, did you ever go to the doctor and they gave you an antidepressant instead of HRT for, a mental health problem? And I was like, that's like such a biased way of asking. That's not science. That's such a biased way of asking a question. Wow. So we need like the good, careful, thoughtful scientists to put these well-tested kind of means of gathering data together. And when we've got more data, then we can say with certainty. And we're already seeing that with, like, say, the UK Biobank as this amazing resource. The more numbers we've got, those little signals might start to become clearer. The signal noise ratio will kind of start to shift, and maybe we'll be able to say some things with more certainty than what we can now. Instead of saying, the data are mixed, sorry, we might be able to say, actually, you know what? If you start taking hormone therapy, as soon as you get vasomotor symptoms and you take it through your skin and you take it for 10 years, that'll reduce your risk of Alzheimer's disease by 0.5%. Maybe we'll be able to say that in time. Who knows? It's all about data. It's so boring. We need to fund the scientists. And you know what the really cool thing about the scientists is? Most of them are women. Lots of Gen X's in there, so good on them. The women of steel, I call them, who are the ones that are doing all of that hard work and asking those questions, and I'm just trying to cheerlead them on.
Brilliant, and very, very much needed. Now, Sarah, our final questions are about what makes you happy and where's your happy place? And I know you like swimming, so tell us more, just to finish off on a brighter note.
I love a little bit of a cold water swim like yourself. I actually, my husband is from Dublin, and whenever we go back, his parents live just up the road from 40 Foot. So I have been known to have a New Year's Eve, swim at 40 Foot in Dublin. I like a bit of cold water. There's that feeling you get when you get out is unbeatable. When we had our COVID lockdowns here in Sydney, me and my youngest son, he was kind of about 12 at the time, it was just, lockdowns were horrible, weren't they? Luckily, where we lived in Sydney, I lived by the beach, and so we swam in the ocean for 100 days in a row. And it was our saving. We started off, we said, let's just swim every day for the next week at the beginning of lockdowns. And then we just had to keep going. And we always say sometimes it was the last thing we wanted and exactly what we needed. Sometimes it would be cold and rainy. We actually had an amazing winter that year. And we'd be like, oh, God, we've got to go and do our swim. And our rule was we had to just get in and under. And if it was really rough, we would go. Where we live in the northern beaches of Sydney, I don't know if you've been to Sydney, all of the beaches have got ocean pools and the rocks at either end of them. So even if the surf's up, or like at the moment, it's unfortunately very sharky, and sadly we had one of a surfer was killed by a shark at the weekend. So everyone in the northern beaches is a little bit rattled at the moment by the sea. Luckily, we've got the ocean pool, so we can go and swim in there. So I think that's my happy place, and luckily my boys have grown up and that's their happy place too. And my husband grew up near the coast in Dublin, and we all sail and the boys surf and we all swim and snorkel, and being in the ocean is our favourite thing. And my second favourite thing is and my husband always brings me a cup of coffee in bed in the morning. I've trained him well. I do like him. I also really like the coffee that he brings me. And I'm very lucky because we're like kind of on a bit of a hill, and our bedroom faces east, and we always sleep with our curtains open. And so we see the sun rise up, and I sit and have my coffee in bed, and we've got this beautiful view out over the bushland, and we can see the sea. And I'm very lucky that that's what I have out my bedroom window. And every single day I'm so thankful, and it sounds so cheesy, I'm not there doing my gratitude journal. I'm just there drinking my coffee, just thinking this is like, that's such a lovely start to my day. I try not to scroll through my phone at the same time and ruin it all. It's not very, it's just tiny little thing. And the older you get, right, I've achieved so many cool things in my career, but still that's my favourite thing, is just sitting having a little cup of coffee in bed in the morning.
I love it. That's beautiful. And the very last question, what advice would you give your younger self?
Oh, man. I wouldn't do anything different to what I did. The younger mother, not when I was a teenager, because I think I made some smart decisions. I don't know. I think I would not change a single thing through my teenage years in uni, apart from maybe saying, people don't care as much about you as what you think they do. But I think it's a rite of passage to figure that out as you get older, rather than be told it, because even if you told it, you wouldn't believe it. I wished I had have known when my boys were really little, because they're 18 months apart, which seemed like a great idea at the time, that, that word matrescence that we use, like to the becoming of a mother, that I had have been kinder to myself, and given myself more kind of grace, and not been so hard on myself to have everything just right, and that there was this perfect way to be a mother and this perfect way to parent, and I just turned myself inside out and into knots, and that time felt very unhappy, even though my boys were cool little dudes who were so straightforward and unproblematic. I just found that phase of life so incredibly difficult, because I don't think I realised that it was a process of becoming a mother. It wasn't that these two little people would come and live in my house like very small flatmates who might wake up at night. So my advice then, which was actually what I was given by a therapist, was that everyone in the world sweeps a floor, and everyone has a dirty floor, and everyone has to pick the little socks up, and to try and find some comfort in those little things. And it's not until I've looked back on that now that I now, I'm ironing my oldest son's school shirts. only because my mother says if you haven't ironed clothes, you look like you're unloved. I'm ironing his school shirts and thinking this time in another week and a half he will have finished school and I won't get to iron his shirt. And so I'm just trying to focus on the smallest little things and find like pleasure and gratefulness in them. Because all of the other stuff's just nothing. It's just rubbish.
I love it. I love it. Sarah, thank you so much. I'm sure people have learned a lot from this conversation, and keep up your brilliant work. And we need to keep pressing evidence-based science. Thank you so much.
Follow me on Instagram.
Read the book.
That's what follow me on
Thank
Instagram.
You.
I'm having a good time on that. I've started doing different things on that and it's been really fun. So that's probably how we ended up connecting too. So.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.